Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to our program, our Martin Luther King Jr. and National Religious Freedom Day program, All Faiths and None, Reimagining Religious Freedom in the 21st Century. I am Dr. Sabrina Dent, and I serve as the president for the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation in Richmond, Virginia, on the beautiful campus of Union Presbyterian Seminary. I want to thank my colleagues and my friend, Dr. Corey Walker, for working behind the scenes with us, as well as our friend Blair Forlaw, who's here with us today, and all of you for being here, and especially our panelists. I'm honored to serve as the president for this organization, the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation. In the last 2 weeks, we've already made steps to ensure that we do our part to work hand in hand with faith leaders and organizers around the country to protect religious freedom and to advance conversations and justice on these issues. We will not take for granted the freedoms that we have, and we realize that there is a long ways to go in helping everyone love their neighbor. As we shared in a joint statement with other faith leaders and faith communities and organizations with our partners in Richmond, Virginia at the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities, we wrote in a joint statement, and we express these sentiments now, that we are relieved and grateful to learn that the members of Congregation Beth Israel were safely reunited with their families. As they seek answers and healing, we, the beloved community, will continue to hold them in our thoughts and prayers. Being people of faith and moral conscience, we are committed to protecting religious freedom and advancing justice so that people of all faiths and none can gather without the threat of harm or discrimination. Yesterday marked National Religious Freedom Day in the United States. It is an observance to commemorate the anniversary of the passing of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom on January 16th, 1786, which eventually made religious freedom a right for most Americans. In 1791, the First Amendment to the Constitution was written, and it reads, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." Although the Constitution and this freedom applies to every person, too often racial and religious minorities are confronted with the realities that America doesn't always live up to its promises. Too often, religious freedom has been used as a term to show more privilege to those who are already privileged in this country. Many people have heard of Christian nationalism. That's when a group of people have an ideology that they express that what it means to be an American is to be Christian, or that in order to be American, you have to adopt the ideas or beliefs of Christians. And this is not true. For us, at the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation, we wanted to seize this moment on this Martin Luther King Day to lean into the possibilities and hope via our conversation about all faiths and none and reimagining religious freedom in the 21st century. This is a mantle that we intend to carry throughout the year in our programming and our engagement and mobilizing efforts. In 1963, Dr. King wrote the letter in the Birmingham jail, speaking directly to white Christian leaders who criticized his efforts and organizers of the freedom movement and their diligence to attain voting rights without discrimination in America, but failed in their moral obligations to live out their faith. There are many noteworthy lines and calls to action from this letter of appeal. But what stands out to me are the words that resonate even today in 2022, as we call on the Senate and the Biden administration to make good on their promises in securing voting rights and religious freedom for all. Reverend Dr. King said, "Now is the time to make the real promise of democracy and transform our pending national elegy into a creative psalm of brotherhood. Now is the time to lift our national policy from the quicksand of racial injustice to the solid rock of human dignity. In observance of Martin Luther King Day and National Religious Freedom Day, this program will explore the intersection of difficult issues around faith and freedom in today's fractured democracy. Our featured panelists will illuminate the issues from a broad spectrum of religious, ideological, and legal perspectives. This experience will set the stage for continued dialogue and community conversations throughout the year. At the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation, faith is our foundation, justice is our calling, and reconciliation is our goal. We are a beloved community of scholars, organizers, faith leaders, citizens that are committed to living our faith by addressing issues that threaten opportunities to build sustainable communities. With that, I am delighted to welcome our panelists for our conversation today. We have with us Dr. Keisha McKenzie. Dr. Keisha McKenzie is the Senior Vice President of Programs at Auburn Seminary. She's held that position since June of 2019. Prior to that, she served as the Director of Digital Strategy and managed the Groundswell Movement organizing community, consulted with other program team members on deepening their impact through Auburn's digital platforms, and collaborated with Auburn communications teams on public or movement-facing content. Keisha is originally from the UK and completed college in Jamaica and graduate studies in technical communication and rhetoric at Texas Tech University, where she supported the provost's office with policy writing, both academic reaccreditation and athletic recertification. Her research addresses the British government's scientific and public communication about weapons of mass destruction, and that's from 2002 and 2003. Post-graduation, Keisha formed the McKinsey Consulting Group, a communication systems level strategy and social good firm. And Keisha has since worked as a communication development strategist, faith organizer, and consultant, and has served on faith-rooted justice nonprofit boards across the United States. As the director of Believe Out Loud, an advocacy digital organizer, LGBTQIA Christian platform, Keisha managed a represented affirming faith-based program, supported justice campaigning among lay people around the US, and led the team into internationalizing the program's content. Keisha participates in Seventh-day Adventist congregations in New York and Maryland, and appears in How to Dialogue film on faith, gender, and sexuality, and is titled Enough Room at the Table. Keisha believes that all people have the inherent worth and dignity that we deserve in this world, where all of us can flourish, and that people have a responsibility to make that world real. Dr. Keisha, we thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
We also have with us Elizabeth Reiner Platt, and she is the director of the Law, Rights, and Religion Project at Columbia Law School. Before joining Columbia, she was a staff attorney at MFY Legal Services Mental Health Law Project. After graduating from New York University School of Law, she was a Carr Center for Reproductive Justice Fellow at A Better Balance. During law school, Liz worked with the Urban Justice Sex Workers Project, New York Civil Liberties Union, and Brennan Center for Justice. In 2013, she published Gangster to Greyhounds, The Past, Present, and Future of Offender Registration, 37 NYU RL and Social Change 777, and that was from 2013. We're delighted to have Liz with us today, and you will hear more from Liz as she is one of the co-authors of the report that we'll be discussing today, as well as Dr. Keisha. So thank you for joining us, Liz. We also have with us Tahil Sharma. Tahil is the regional coordinator for United Religions Initiative North America. He is a native of Southern California, born into a Hindu and Sikh family. As described on his personal website, he writes, I am an interfaith and social justice advocate based in Los Angeles. I work with a variety of different organizations to make religious pluralism a social and productive norm within society. I do this with the building of beloved community through educational and sometimes uncomfortable dialogue, as well as through the lens of promoting justice and equity for all. Tahil is a respected and trusted thought leader. In addition to his work at URI, he works with the Episcopal Diocese of Los Angeles and is a Hindu director for the Office of Religious Life at the University of Southern California. Tahil serves on several boards, including Sahana, AMP Global Youth, a project for Americans for Informed Democracy. And he is no stranger to the Parliament of the World's Religions, Interfaith Youth Corps, and many other faith-based and secular organizations. He has been featured in many publications, including the Religion News Service, BBC News, the Interfaithish Podcast, the Associated Press, and the Center for American Progress. And he's here with us today. And Tahil, we thank you that you're here with us under the circumstances. And I highly recommend that you read the bios for all of our panelists, as they're all amazing people. So Tahil, Liz, Keisha, thank you all for joining us today. So I would like to give you all the opportunity to really start our conversation. And I know I've said so much already, but I would like to give you the opportunity to join in this conversation with me by answering this question, to really reflect on this and for you to share. How do you enter today's conversation about religious freedom and about National Religious Freedom Day? And why is it important that your organizations raise awareness about what is happening in the public square? And so we'll start with you, Dr. Keisha.
Thanks so much, Dr. Dent. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. I lead the program team at Auburn. As you heard, it's a multi-faith organization that hosts leadership cohorts, strategic partnerships, and research-based work in areas from reproductive justice and economic justice to LGBTQ rights and religious liberty. And because of that, we understand religious liberty, not just in terms of the laws that we heard about, the Constitution, state-based religious freedom laws, but in terms of community building. What does it take to live well together? And so our work over decades, and indeed like 200 years at this point, has been with people from many, many different backgrounds, traditions, and we've learned that it's possible to build up with those people from our highest values to increase people's thriving rather than to increase suffering on those who are least able to bear it. And that community building work takes lots of negotiation, lots of listening, lots of intentional relationship, and building up from the well of people's deepest values with the understanding that we're in community, building the society that we live in together, and that we have the well-being not just of ourselves and those we love in our families, but also the well-being of the entire planet is in our hands. And there's this recurring political temptation to hoard rights. So there is a temptation where you might have the legal right to do something, but the implications of that thing affect more than you and your congregation or your community. And we have the responsibility and obligation to think about the wider network of neighbors that we're a part of. So early on in the pandemic, Auburn worked with leaders of faith and moral courage across the country to call people together around those themes that we ordinarily do call people together around: reflection, connection, service, common action, worship, and prayer. And we used the theme of faithful distance as the ethic by which we asked people who were leaders of congregations to have the courage to close their gatherings, to close their communities, to mitigate the worst impacts of the pandemic on our friends, neighbors, and colleagues. And that was what faith meant to us at that point in the pandemic. And we used all the tools we have from emails and other digital content to help spread that word. and to resource local congregations who are thinking about how to transition from in-person experiences to something that was virtually mediated, much like this conversation is. And the reason that we did that was because being faithful doesn't have to mean using faith as a cudgel against others, or dodging practices that would mitigate viral spread just because it means that you can still retain offering flow. Faith can mean also that you look to whatever would protect somebody who is more vulnerable than yourself. And so Liz has done some great research. I hope she'll speak to it a little bit about religious organizations seeking through lawsuits to dodge those public health restrictions. And that's one thing that religion has been doing, but also religious people have the potential to do so much good. And I hope that we'll also speak about that today. But with 850,000 people already died from COVID, we can be clear that when we're using religious exemptions to allow some religious people to make others more vulnerable to illness or premature death, that's dishonoring the spirit of religious freedom in ways that harm us all, including religious people. And in a plural society, religious freedom needs to work for people of all faiths and none, not just for a favored few. And when I think about Coleyville, and I'm glad you brought that up earlier, and Charleston and Oak Creek, even Charlottesville, it makes me long for a society where people are free to live and worship in safety and in health without government interference and without targeted violence because of who they are or what they believe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Keisha. Yes, you've said so much, and I appreciate your framing and context and bringing it into the moment of talking about COVID and the religious discrimination that we continue to see happening. So thank you. Liz, I want to invite you to come into this conversation with us to share, what about the work that you're doing and why this moment is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, I'm the director of the Law, Rights, and Religion Project, or LRRP, at Columbia. And for those who are new to the organization, we are a law and policy think tank that promotes religious freedom, pluralism, and social justice. And, you asked how we came to the work. I came to religious liberty work, almost by accident. LLRP is based at the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law. A major focus of the organization when I joined about 6-7 years ago, was this onslaught of religious exemption legislation that we saw as a really grave threat to the movement for LGBTQ equality and for reproductive justice. And I think as I grew in my understanding of the work and my appreciation and love for the work and the position, the organization, came to realize that the need was, I think, so much greater than just stemming this tide. It was really not just kind of saying, well, religious liberty is important, but there's this desperate need to preserve these other sexual liberty and equality rights, but there was really a much greater need to provide another side of the conversation of what religious liberty looks like and what it means and why it's important, and really do some deep thinking about, sort of as Dr. McKenzie said, about how do we live well together, with the legal focus. And I know we'll get to this later, but that's what I think is kind of so beautiful about the partnership with Auburn is there's really interesting, I think, dialogue that we've come to have between the kind of legal thinking and the real moral visioning. So that's how I come to the work, with a background, predominantly in gender justice law, and I think have through conversation been able to build out, certainly my own personal, and I hope the organization's understanding of why religious liberty is important for all faiths and none, well beyond that kind of push and pull of the exact legal limits of religious exemptions. And I think that will, I hope, lead us nicely into kind of the principles that we developed.
Thank you so much, Liz. I appreciate that. The legal thinking and the moral visioning, right? That combination is so necessary. And the question, going back to Dr. Keisha's question, how do we live well together? Tahil, I want to bring you in on that question, because being the work that you do in interfaith space, can you tell me how you entered this conversation that we're having today?
Thank you, Sabrina. So I come into this conversation wearing a number of different hats, but I also come into this conversation understanding that talking about religious freedom means really investing in the power of the people. The idea that we come from a diverse fabric like the United States, with its estranged history, with a history filled with baggage, we come to understand that the framing of the founders of this country was not with the intent of many of us in mind, but it still had some inkling of understanding that diversity and pluralism is going to be a bigger norm. And that's what we're still trying to strive for in 2022. We aren't strangers to the fact that 2 years of this pandemic, in the middle of a political and media circus with so many things going on, means that we haven't actually gotten to a point of a better circumstance. We're still in the middle of a lot of chaos. And if it hasn't become very clear across the board, people of faith and moral conscience remain major stakeholders in the conversation for the direction and the polarity at which this country is going forward. And this can be both very good and very bad at the same time. When we work with grassroots communities, as I do through the United Religions Initiative, through Sadhana, Coalition of Progressive Hindus, through the Interfaith Youth Corps and a couple of other organizations, it becomes very clear that this idea of striving for religious freedom is still riddled with a lot of comfort in doing interfaith work. There's this idea that we still exist within a niche community that is separate from society itself, when in reality, pluralism, interfaith cooperation, and fighting for religious freedom is a daily norm. It's something we're striving for every day. It should be a part of a bigger routine that we're aiming for, acknowledging that this is a part of how we have to move forward together. And it takes a lot of energy and it takes a lot of courage and audacity that has to be framed in a more positive and a more meaningful light for people to understand its potency and its impact over time. So I'm excited to bring that kind of framework into the conversation today.
Thank you so much, Tahil. I appreciate that. You said fighting for religious freedom should be a part of a bigger norm, right? Like this should be our everyday, especially if we're fighting for humanity. So what I want to do is I want to invite all of you to, I'm trying to pin all of you on the screen at once, but invite you to pin yourselves onto the screen so everyone can see you for this conversation. But based on what you've shared with us, we've talked about the legal thinking, the moral reason, and the question of how do we live well together. Tahil, you said it's investing in the power of the people. These are all important things that we need to think about in this conversation when we're talking about all faiths and none. And so we have this report that was written in 2020, October 2020. And people might be like, okay, well, it's 2022. Why don't we revisit this report? Because too often, at least for me, what I see is that reports get written and then people move on from them. And I'm like, no, because the work is still happening and the work is still necessary. So let's have this conversation about Dr. Keisha and Liz. Can you tell me, why was it important for your two institutions to author this report about religious freedom, and how did this partnership happen?
I'll start, and Liz, jump off from there. So in 2020, Liz invited us to join her in helping to build out these 6 principles and ideals that community members and institutional decision makers could use regardless of their tradition to build constructive conversation around religious freedom. And my sense of the principles was that they emerged from the LRRP's report, Whose Faith Matters, which was published in 2019. And based on that, we're arguing in the report that religious liberty has to be neutral, non-coercive, non-discriminatory, not absolute, democratic, and pluralistic. And we had a designer kind of mock up 6 icons of these, each principle with its own icon, as a way to help people who are not in this space all the time, like kind of grapple with it and prioritize. And what we wanted the principles to be able to do was to speak to several contexts, not just the usual ones that Liz mentioned, the LGBTQ rights and repro, but employee rights and medical care and immigration advocacy, public accommodations, i.e. public accommodations being that phrase that captures our ability to be in public space on an equal basis with anybody else, like hotels and restaurants and shops. And we wanted to also create a guide based on these principles that helped media specialists, reporters, journalists, interviewers to reshape and think about, is the way that I'm framing this particular article unconsciously privileging one form of belief over others? Am I asking the right kinds of questions to think about the power of an employee versus the power of their employer? And all of these sorts of subsidiary questions that help to trouble those kinds of orders of the way that things are usually discussed, the way that power is usually entrenched, and the way that we ask different questions, centering people who are most vulnerable, centering the people who have least power, least institutional and structural power. That can help us to get to a situation where everybody around the table actually can speak into the issue. And so what my contribution was at that stage earlier on was to invite a multi-faith group of religious and spiritual leaders from Auburn's network to speak into the report, to read it, to look at its recommendations, to invite us to think about things that we might have missed. And ultimately, the goal was to protect individual religious practice, to protect minoritized religious groups, to protect non-religious people, and to protect other fundamental freedoms alongside religious freedom. Because often when you talk about religious freedom, people think about, where can I worship? Or people think about, do I have the ability to retain my job because I worship on a different day than many other people? But also religious freedom does not thrive unless you have the freedom to express. And it doesn't thrive unless you have the freedom to associate. And it doesn't thrive unless you have freedom of conscience. And so like thinking about it in the context of all these other fundamental expression rights is a way to make sure that it doesn't kind of run away as a train on its own track.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Keisha. Liz, please come into this conversation and share with us.
Well, I always hate to follow Dr. McKenzie because what more is there to add? But yeah, I think to just add a little bit more. I think that the impetus. We did get the 6 principles originally from Whose Faith Matters, but if you go even further back, I'll mention that Whose Faith Matters itself was the product of a number of cross-movement, multi-faith convenings that LLRP held over the course of years, tackling kind of issues that, again, are not the headline splashy media stories about what religious liberty is and what it means. So we did, for example, an entire convening devoted to what does a religious liberty mean when it comes to immigration, and looking at things like, both religious minority refugees, sanctuary communities who are housing, folks at risk for deportation in sanctuaries, with the knowledge also that there are religious immigrant religious minorities that are also subject to religious discrimination. So, for example, the denial of reproductive health care in facilities that are housing undocumented minors at the border, and thinking through all these kind of cross-cutting issues with a really smart, interesting group of diverse people. So we held a series of convenings like that to, again, kind of try to scratch the surface and change from the very shallow discussion of religious liberty that often, gets discussed in many of these conversations that we hear, to a much deeper understanding, more nuanced understanding. So that was, Whose Faith Matters. And then Dr. McKenzie talked about kind of developing the relationship with Auburn. And she did not mention the lovely introduction she also wrote to the report. And yeah, and I think we wrote the report in part just to get people to ask questions, and not because these issues are easy and we have all the answers, but because they're hard and we need tools, to think through these kind of complicated scenarios in which, often, a person filing a lawsuit is going to say this is an egregious religious liberty violation for my client, but we want to get people to thinking, well, who else is involved? Who else's religious liberty is at play here? In terms of, to take the kind of obvious example, the baker who doesn't want to bake a cake. Well, what are the religious faiths of the employee who works at that bakery? What are the religious beliefs of the larger community that needs access to services? And that might be chilled in exercising their faith publicly if that means that they can't get goods and services. To ask those kinds of questions, larger questions about, I'm going to keep hearing this, I think, because I think that note about just like, how do we all live in this really complicated pluralistic world in a way that we can all, survive and thrive, was really a big part of the impetus.
So to that point, I actually want to raise some things because you all said a lot there. And I want to raise, you talked about, Dr. Keisha, religious freedom not just being about one's right to believe or not to believe, to practice, not to practice, what have you, right? That it's also about other issues. And one of the ones that was raised was by Liz is immigration. And so in this report, there are so many examples that you all talk about, and I do want to highlight and have us to talk about the values, like how religious freedom has been used as a tool to discriminate against certain groups over time, and continues to be in many different ways. And we see that right now, even as you mentioned about LGBTQ rights. But to go back to this intro, written by Dr. Keisha, I just want to highlight some things for the people that haven't read the report. And so there is this, Dr. Keisha wrote, animated by our faiths and deep ethical convictions, people from every tradition and culture are looking afresh at how our social institutions, federal, state, and local laws, and institutional policies have locked in a cruel, conflictual vision of community and culture, and a country, and we yearn for a different moral view, one expansive enough for all. Now, that is a very powerful statement that you wrote to even start off this letter. And I thought it was so important because of the fact that you're leaning into talking about religious freedom through a moral lens, right? And so I would like right now, if you all could just speak more to these values and speak more to the values that were highlighted in the report. And I could read, I actually highlighted so many things that Dr. Keisha said in this first letter, because it's critical to painting the picture for the vision that we hope for in reimagining religious freedom in this country. So the first part is the fact that, we are challenged by the fact that people don't prioritize people who, in many cases, not all, right? People don't prioritize the religious convictions or beliefs of other people because they're like, this is not what I believe. I believe this particular thing. So I believe that I have the right to lean into my faith more on this issue. And so we see it when it comes to reproductive health care. And so one of the things that I would like for you all to talk about is with this first principle about religious freedom being that it must be neutral. So the ways in which that, and you highlighted in the report that both the that is mandated by the free exercise clause as well as the establishment clause, that these policies must be neutral. But that's not what we see in the public square. And so one of the examples that was given in this report that was highlighted from the previous administration, presidential administration, I would say, was, the Muslim ban. that was enacted. That was one of the ways in which, it was not being applied. Religious freedom was not neutral. It was targeting a specific religious community. At the same time, I want us not to forget that it also targeted African nations. And so it is important for us to look at that. But can you talk about what does that neutrality looks like? What does it look like in the recommendations that were made here in the report? And Liz, since you're on the screen, I'll have you to go first.
Sure. So I think the reproductive rights example that you gave is such a powerful example for the ways in which we don't even see the lack of neutrality sometimes within the law. So, I think an example that is in the report that I use very often is that there are many laws, both at the state and the federal level, that offer some level of protection to medical providers who don't want to provide abortion care because it conflicts with their deeply held beliefs. But there are many medical providers who see offering abortion care as an extension of their religious and moral responsibility to provide, sensitive and comprehensive medical care to people who need it. And those two things are not treated, those two religious beliefs are not treated equally under the law currently. So you can have, for example, and I'll just take my own faith to make it easier, like you can have a Reform Jewish doctor who's working at a Catholic medical facility who is not allowed to act on their religious and ethical obligations to provide an abortion care. But if you flip it and you have an anti-abortion medical provider working at, let's say, a Reform Jewish hospital, that person is allowed to opt out. So there's an imbalance there, but you can see how long it even took me to explain that. It's not super catchy. And the fact of the matter is we're still in a place, despite the fact that there are so many people of faith who support reproductive rights, where the kind of shorthand narrative is still religious equals anti-abortion. And so I think that's just a really powerful example of, and I'm sure there's ones many that you can think of that I can't, but these little kind of imbalances in the law that we've become so accustomed to and that it existed for so long that we barely even see them as non-neutral. And so I think, I think the report tries to take just a really hard look and a critical assessment to think, where can these be evened out? And I think, you can certainly, I think the Muslim ban is, perhaps one of the most egregious examples of non-neutrality over the past few years. But I think if you went through, immigration law, national security law, criminal law, you would find countless kind of smaller examples that, again, we've just grown so accustomed to that we barely even see them.
And I think that speaks to like the narrative dominance of certain groups in the US, whether that's in terms of who gets seen as the default or the ordinary, and then who gets seen as the exception. And we always look at the exception with a bit more scrutiny. So if we think about the narrative landscape in the US as uneven with the historic white middle class, propertied, landowning, and slave owning classes, shaping the laws that created the first few years of the foundation of the country. And then, as Tahil was saying, like people, many of us on this call, not even imagined as stakeholders in what would become of the nation. So like from that very beginning, you see uneven ground in the definitions, in the laws, and in the ways the principles which are worthy are applied to different groups of people. That goes back centuries, and it might take centuries to undo. But like I feel encouraged when we're in conversations like this, where we're even actually naming that, because that's not the culture that I grew up in. Like it's not the culture of being able to name that something is foundationally awry and that we have to reshape it structurally in order to get to the ideal of a space where all the laws and policies apply neutrally to people of all backgrounds. Like that's new. And I appreciate it. And I want us to be able to build on it as we move forward.
I mean, it's necessary that we build on that, especially if we say that if we want to live up to the ideas or beliefs of the nation that we perceive ourselves to be. And I'm saying that because this nation perceives itself one particular way, and still all of us on this call could speak to a reality that points to like the broken promises that continue to happen, that continue to impact our communities. And I think it's important for those that are watching. I don't want to take for granted that everyone is aware, but we know that one of the first executive orders that President Biden did was to remove the Muslim ban. And so there was a lot of advice that was given around that. At the same time, in talking about the neutrality of it, when I was reading the report, one of the things that I thought about was the significance for pieces of legislation such as like the Equality Act and the Do No Harm Act and the role that they play in protecting the rights of LGBTQ individuals, the civil and human rights, but even expanding those for other individuals. So when we're talking about healthcare, one of the things I often think about weighing into my own experience as a Black woman in America is even how reproductive health is still a part of this conversation. And when you think about the reality that Black women in America are 3 to 4 times more likely to die in childbirth and then when you think about that there are certain religious beliefs or individuals that hold certain religious beliefs that are pushing agendas that then have implications for healthcare and for access for women to get healthcare or to get to have reproductive freedom in many different ways. Because also I want to state this: not every person that's seeking birth control is seeking it for the reasons that people will suggest. There are many different reasons why people use birth control, and some of them may be hormonal. So I think it's important for people to think about that. But Tahil, I want to pull you into this conversation because I'm curious to know, what are the conversations that are happening right now? You've heard Dr. Keisha and Liz talk about this neutrality. What are the conversations that are happening in interfaith spaces about religious freedom and the ways in which it's been applied? Because you work with a lot of communities where there are people that identify as religious minorities in this country, right? And so I want to know, what are those people saying, and what is the narrative that you want people watching this call to hear as far as the work that is happening?
It's a great question, and I think it's something that both Keisha and Liz have both addressed really clearly, in that it's actually a very multi-layered sentiment and addressing of the issue of religious freedom. So in many cases, you will find that a lot of what we've just engaged with in this conversation will not be seen as correct to talk about in religious spaces, because we are engaging in politics per se. And a lot of religious communities and therefore interfaith communities feel like if we start edging ourselves into these spaces of talking about politics and society, we are actually stepping away from religion and spirituality. So therefore, a lot of communities will take the stance of neutrality and saying, oh, we are an apolitical space because we are welcoming of people that are different. But the minute that difference actually impacts, marginalizes, or oppresses communities, the communities don't actually know how to address the issue. So they begin to say, therefore we cannot talk about it, therefore it is a non-issue for us. And what that does is it actually creates a great disservice to communities that get impacted by a lot of what's happening in politics and society. Many of us are very familiar with things like the Muslim ban during the Trump administration, the conversation about the SCOTUS case with the bakery that discriminated against LGBTQ people. A lot of those things don't come up in a lot of interfaith spaces because the idea of being unified among people who are different from you is for conforming and for assimilating, not for actually acknowledging those differences. And it poses a challenge to how we actually are able to engage in this deeper idea of freedom. And actually, at the end of the day, even freedom is not the right term, it's liberation. We're still stuck in this motif that within a lot of interfaith spaces, I can't speak for every single one, that because we are aiming for equality amongst people who are different, that we must all therefore become unified and essentially the same. And that actually denies the layers of context and nuance that allow us to actually feel like we can be unified across difference while acknowledging that those differences are important and necessary for us to engage, rather than as coefficients to be removed from an entire equation. And it becomes a challenge, unfortunately, to see more stakeholders that are religious and spiritual who engage in these conversations, because what we now have issue with is also layered with misinformation that easily gets spread in interfaith communities. We also have layerings of talking about interfaith cooperation as solely talking about the work of love and compassion, in using those words as cop-outs and not using them for their actual definitions. Which results in dehumanizing people, which results in taking away from their experiences, and actually does not allow them to feel that interfaith communities are welcoming spaces to them, because they don't want to engage in the issues that actually keep them from freedom. And that continues to be a big problem, but this is where we actually look to, some organizations that are actually really focused on calling out and saying that it is in our nature, it is in our history, it is in our tradition to engage with what is audacious and make it courageous. Where engaging in politics is actually a very religious act. And it's based on challenging and rebelling against the tyranny and the injustice that continues to, overflow and break at the seams of most institutions in society. And that's the organizations that I sort of turn to for that hope that I often look for in interfaith spaces, because you then begin to realize that those who seem so different actually look at each other and say, aha, not only do I see someone completely different from me, but I actually see myself in that person. I see myself as mutually responsible to them, just as they're responsible to me. And that is the narrative of how we're trying to engage with interfaith work now, that seems to have more potency and sustainability, rather than the older models that were just focused on dialogue and relationship building. Because there is an engagement there, there's an active participation there that's saying, oh, this struggle is real, but I don't feel like I'm alone, because just because I don't know that person who is completely different from me doesn't mean I can't trust them, and that doesn't mean they aren't an accomplice to me in this work. And that actually will take us into a better framework later that actually will make things more robust in how we do this justice work. And we're teetering between those different movements. The old guard, which is very much, let's meet monthly, let's have these dialogues, let's talk about why peace and justice are important. And then you have the community organizers and the activists who are like, okay, if we talk about this one more time, we're going to have a problem. Why don't we act on it? Why don't we organize around it and actually show the potential that we have and put it out into the world?
I really love what you just said, particularly today. So today being MLK Day, or at least the day that we get off because there is an MLK Day. I was reading this morning a little reflection on the president who signed that holiday into law and who didn't actually support any of the things that Martin Luther King actually fought for when he was alive. And so it goes to the question of how sometimes when you memorialize an individual or a movement, you kind of get to suck out what made it vital. And what I hear in Tahil's last comment would be, there's ways that people of faith and moral courage, or moral conscience, as some of you have said today, have this vitality that benefits the collective, regardless of people's particular religious affiliations. And so we're not talking about like an infusion of church-state collusion when we talk about people of faith acting in public life. We're talking about people of faith as natural stakeholders and neighbors, thinking about with others, what makes that life in community better? What does it mean to be able to make sure that the neighbor who's next to you, whatever their religious practices are, can get the medical care that they need, can secure and retain a job, can secure housing, can have a social safety net when they need it. And those are the practical considerations that we have, which means that it's necessarily political. It doesn't mean that it's partisan necessarily, but it means that it's political because politics is about the use and distribution of resources and the use and distribution of power and decision-making ability. And so those are the things that make it a political conversation, but people of faith, because faith spaces also themselves are political because they govern resources and they determine power and they determine decision-making. And so I love the way that you thought about that in terms of differing models of people showing up together, whether it's just to have tea and cucumber sandwiches. I love cucumber sandwiches, but sometimes that's not all you need to do. Have a cucumber sandwich and plot to change the world too.
Yes, I love it. I love it. That is so important. And it's important that we push those boundaries in those conversations, right? Because you have to consider the whole person. I think about when you were saying that, Tahil, like the work that, even in the work that I did during my doctoral research, I talked about how if interfaith spaces don't have those conversations about the issues that confront the people that are in the community that are sitting there around the table, then, and if they don't allow people to bring their whole selves into that space and all of their identities, then we tend to be hypocrites of the very missions that we proclaim that we support. And so it's very important that we talk about that. And there's so much more I had to ask about the neutrality of religious freedom, but I want to move forward in talking about the importance of religious liberty being non-coercive. And so Liz, like if you could just weigh in a little bit more with that. You talked about how in this report, it was written that religious exemptions are coercive and that they protect religious liberty of one party by requiring another party to bear the cost of that exemption. Can you speak more to that? I know you touched on it earlier when you were talking about the COVID exemptions, but the experiences and what you're seeing in the legal space of these conversations happening that need to be understood by those that are engaging us on this webinar today.
Sure. So I think it's, when it comes to religious liberty violations, I think it's really clear to, well, hopefully for most people, it's really clear to be able to see kind of the coercive power of the state. So these are like the kind of traditional church state violation issues of, you know, the legislature, you know, hanging a Christian flag in the, you know, outside the state house, or, you know, declaring themselves to be a Christian nation. That sort of coercive power is, should be flatly unconstitutional. I think I will admit that the Establishment Clause has been incredibly eroded over the past few decades. It's really a shell of what it once was. But that said, I think I would certainly consider, you know, the coercive power of the state to be, you know, where they adopt a particular religious beliefs or identity to be kind of an obvious violation of this non-coercion principle. When it comes to exemptions, I think it can be trickier to kind of see those. And then, and I'll quickly say, I don't mean all religious exemptions, because some religious exemptions are really not about enforcing particular beliefs on other people, but are about like very modest accommodations that are needed for religious minorities whose rights are not already sort of baked into our law and social structure to exist on an equal playing field. So for example, you know, being able to wear a turban or a hijab in the military, or being able to take off for, you know, Yom Kippur from school, et cetera. But when we talk about religious exemptions that are really saying you have this, you know, very important, for example, right to non-discrimination, which folks have had since the passage of the Civil Rights Amendment, you know, but that actually gets trumped by my religious liberty right. That often gets framed as sort of a religious liberty versus an equality right. And that's all people see. But actually, if I am losing my right to a non-discriminatory workplace and my right to go out and buy goods and services on the marketplace, and my right to a safe and habitable apartment to accommodate someone else's religious beliefs. Like, I see that as a deep equality issue, but also a really deep religious liberty issue, and that the government is saying that I lose these incredibly important rights because of religious beliefs that I certainly don't adhere to at all, and that are entirely antithetical to my faith beliefs and to my faith identity and my ability to live, all the things that we were saying before, live and work and have safe housing. So that is, something that we tried to flesh out in the report and to scratch the surface and saying these are always framed as a matter of equality, but actually when you're being asked to make these enormous legal sacrifices to advance religious beliefs that are completely antithetical to your worldview, that is a violation of your religious liberty. And a violation of this kind of non-coercion principle where you're being sucked in to advance religious beliefs that are not yours.
And so that actually, to me, what you just stated actually leads into that next principle about it being non-discriminatory, right? Because then there is discrimination that is taking place by then having someone to adapt a belief or to even alter their life for the sake of someone else's beliefs. And so that is very damaging. And we see it happen quite a bit. One of the things that, and Liz, if you could raise awareness on just recently, I know the Supreme Court has, decided to hear the case about with the high school and the prayer with the coach. And so can you speak to that a little bit, if you can weigh in on that? Because there's concern, and I saw it even exhibited this past weekend, and I'm trying to frame it in the best way possible, where the newly elected governor in the state of Virginia took the privilege of praying during the opening ceremony. And so he has the right to practice his beliefs and everything, but as serving as a government official, right, that is problematic that would take place. So can you talk more about these examples and how it shows up again in the public square? And sometimes, like you said, because it's baked, I think maybe Dr. Keisha may have said this earlier, it's baked in how people, it's baked into the culture of how America operates, right? So some people overlook it, whereas, those of us that are doing this work might grab our chest and gasp when we see these things happening. Because can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think this is certainly we could have a much better Supreme Court than we have that would get these issues. But I think even in the best of circumstances, this is another example of how the law can be just a completely inadequate tool for understanding these issues, because you often have a legal dispute that's between party A and party B, and everything else gets lost. And so you have this one, in this example, the one high school football coach who's saying, I as an individual have this deep, need to pray with my students, and it's required for my religious beliefs, and is, asking the court to hear his story and protect his beliefs and his understanding of what he needs to do. And I think who we don't necessarily always get to hear in these stories is, the one atheist kid who's out there trying to watch a football game and is seeing, all his classmates join hands in prayer, or what, I will admit to not being an expert yet in the exact details of this case. But I mean, if I'm again, this is just how these things get framed, is we hear the kind of sound bite and we lose so much context and so much nuance. And that's really where, these things, the ability of the majority to kind of continue, as it always does, re-entrenching power and continuing to frame these issues and continuing to create the larger platform in which all of these issues get played out is, I feel like I'm not being very articulate here, but I think I'm doing my best to say that, yeah, I mean, I think that the law can just collapse a lot of nuance and a lot of different experiences by asking you to just focus on this one person who gets to kind of stand up and, claim that their religious liberty is being violated, and all the other voices kind of get toned down.
And go ahead, Dr. Keisha.
No, just briefly, I think the thing that concerns me about leaning on the adversarial nature of the law, which is what I think Liz was speaking to, is that it kind of traps you, and it also traps the government into picking expressions of religion. So even within the same religions, you have diversity and plurality. And often it's only one element in a religion that gets to take the symbol role in the public sphere. So the conservative Catholic would be the one who is the archetypal Catholic. And the archetypal Catholic is the one that doesn't do abortions and is against contraception. And that's part of the robust discussion and debate within Catholicism about what is the human dignity of the person, and what does moral choice mean, and what does that mean then when I go to the pharmacy? Like, that's an internal intra-religious debate. And the risk of the way that things have been set up so far would be that the Supreme Court or the district court is the one determining which Catholic is really Catholic. And we don't want that for anybody. We don't want them determining who is an Adventist. We don't want them determining who is a Hindu. We don't want them determining who is a humanist. And it's for the people within each tradition to wrestle with the heritage of that tradition and to evolve that tradition in the direction we hope of greater love and justice and care for others inside and outside the group. But it's not the government's role to do that. And the risk of allowing the law to be the only determinant of progress in this area is that the governments and legal arguments and successful rhetoric is the way that gets resolved, and that's not how it's going to work if all people are going to get the dignity they deserve.
Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Keisha. I mean, I'm looking at the report because I know we're coming up on a time and we're going to start the Q&A, but I want to move forward to like the conclusion of this report, and to because you presented these 6 principles in the report, and for those of you that do not get the privilege of hearing all 6 talked about right now in this conversation, that I highly recommend that you read the report. Is about 26 pages, but you talk about it being that religious liberty should be neutral, non-coercive, non-discriminatory, balanced against other rights, democratic and pluralistic. And it's stated at the end of this report, religious liberty should protect and preserve the rights of all people to participate in public life and access to common goods. And I think that is so important, and also at all levels of public life, policy making, and governance, that you hope that leaders of moral courage, and including those of faith, will continue to do so. And I think it's so important for us to think about that, is because when we think about law, the way in which laws are applied on a state and local level, that each state is different, and it's in some ways not new for states to operate as their own countries, because in the founding, that's how they did, right? They made their own laws. They pledged allegiance to their own state and everything. So for it to become united was a struggle, and it's still a struggle today, right? So to have these laws applied in ways that validate the human dignity of every person, no matter what they believe or don't believe, and how they show up in the world, who they love, is important when we know that a person can go from one state and have like a positive experience in another state, be discriminated against because of who they love or their experiences. And so with this, I want to know from you, Dr. Keisha and Liz, if you could share and Tahil, I want you to weigh in on this question too, but specifically to the report, what do you want people to walk away from with this report, knowing if today, they say, I'm not going to read it. What is the one thing that you want want them to know? Because I mean, somebody might say they're not going to read the report. We got to be real. I'm an optimist, so I hope that people would. But what is the thing that you want to walk away from this? And then also the second question, and Tahil, this is where I want you to weigh in. What happens if people of moral courage and faith stop talking about this? What happens if we don't continue to push our narratives and helping people to understand why religious freedom should be for all, inclusive of all, and not exclude any person? And what are the ways in which, what's a simple way that people can do this to honor, even thinking about the legacy of Dr. King? And I'm gonna add into that Coretta Scott King, because that sister pushed him along and was there with him through the fight, as well as the other freedom fighters that joined hands. And we know that some of those freedom fighters came from many different traditions and none. They had many different identities. And one person that I'll raise, just even in thinking about, Bayard Rustin, right, who was an advisor to Dr. King. And so what do you want people to walk away with after today's conversation?
As we've been using these principles in conversation with people who are doing organizing in their community, like one of the things I've been asking folks is what enables our community to flourish? Just to ask that question, what is it that helps our community to flourish? And it's not just what helps me to flourish as an individual, but what helps us to flourish collectively. And that draws people into a space where they're thinking about, what is it that my neighbor needs? And what is it that we can only do if we do it together? And when I have things that I might have to kind of put to the side, like what's the collective benefit if I do that? And if I choose to do that for the sake of what helps us to flourish? Do we really need winners and losers if we're in this together? And if we don't need winners and losers, then maybe we can jettison the idea that, you know, we use the law to protect us against our neighbors. What if we use the laws to support what the neighbors need? And so to ask a different kind of question, a different quality of question, is what I hope people, whether they read the full report or just look at the principles or just look at the icons or just listen to what we said today, that's what I hope people will begin to do, to ask a different kind of question and get out of the adversarial default.
Thank you, Dr. Keisha. Tahil, if you could jump in here, please.
Just to allow myself for some transparency, I did not read the report, which, you know, puts me in the context that I cannot entirely answer this question. With that said, I think based on what both Liz and Keisha have both brought into the space, is also very important to think about, in that the legalistic, the academic, and the more pragmatic ways in which we're addressing these conversations also require us to think deeply in the social and cultural contexts of how we need to address these issues. Because not every one of our faith communities, or not any interfaith community, is deeply invested in this idea of religious freedom as being front and center to the work that they're doing. They just want to live and exist. And that's kind of the point that we're trying to make to them, that Keisha just made, which is, when you're fighting for religious freedom, you kind of have to understand the urgency that it comes with for you to be able to exist in the first place. If you're not fighting for the very idea that you deserve to exist and thrive equally among other spaces and communities, this becomes a rat race. And that's the last thing that we need in an environment that is already so chaotic. And on top of that, we also have to be mindful that striving for religious freedom and liberty also requires us to be able to build bridges with other communities. Time and time again, we act as if our own faith community is the only one in peril. And we have to stop behaving that way, because much of this peril is rooted in other people's peril as well. And if you're not willing to lean into acknowledging and recognizing and seeing the pain of others, they will not see your pain either. And just as an example, to really demonstrate the point of how this pain works, is I'm thinking about what happened this weekend at the synagogue in Colleyville, Texas, where the man took three people and the rabbi hostage, and the person who forced the rabbi to call another rabbi in New York to get a prisoner released. In my world, religious freedom doesn't just mean that I can practice my religion freely. It means I can also practice it safely without misinformation controlling the narrative and leading to these kinds of situations. It means that people from the Jewish community, among others, do not have to constantly be in a state of fear, in a state of insecurity when it comes to being able to thrive. So it has to go beyond what is the legal framework and make it a part of a social and a cultural norm to say that religious freedom is making sure that we're helping each other to thrive at the end of the day.
Thank you, Tahil. Liz, please.
Sure. I love listening to both of those. I think I'm gonna maybe take like a much narrower bite of the apple and say I think that one of my goals with the piece is just to have folks take a more critical approach to even the very term religious liberty, so that when they're picking up their newspaper in the morning and they see that term and it gets thrown around constantly, and I would say even more and more each year, certainly when we're talking about the law, to take that critical approach and to think, okay, so we're talking about the religious liberty of the coach. What about the people in the audience? What about the one atheist or Jewish or Sikh team player on the team? What about the one teacher in the school that's been ostracized? To say, well, okay, religious liberty, but what exactly are we talking about here? The liberty to do what? The liberty for whom? The liberty from whom? And from what? So that. I think that's a much narrower approach to what we're doing. I think we got a really nice kind of larger picture, but that's my sort of very practical, just since there was an insinuation that academics are not practical, which mon dieu, but I will take a very practical approach and say that.
Thank you, Liz. And I'm glad that you took that practical approach to state that. As I think about like the reality, when you stated that, I think about reports that came out by SALDIF, I believe last year, if not the year before, because, in COVID, everything has run together in terms of the years, right? But there was a report where they shared how Sikh American children had talked about being bullied in the classroom, even by their teachers, right? Like how teachers had targeted them. Similar to that, there was a report that came out by the Hindu American Foundation, and even the experiences of atheist people and how they have been treated. And to make it even more narrower for this conversation, even how Black atheists and secular individuals are targeted the most, and it usually comes from their engagement with their families and even religious communities. And so I think it is important for us to look at that through that narrow perspective of how it impacts even that one individual in the room. There are moral injuries that have happened in the name of religion. And so, so we have a responsibility to continue these conversations and deeply engage. And I thank you for writing this report and really weighing into it and presenting it through a moral lens that has not often been used to share. Has not been used to share and talk about religious freedom. And so I see that there are a few questions that have been put forward to our panel. And so the first question that I read, I believe we addressed it, but someone wrote, how do we work out religious freedom in situations where two people's or groups' beliefs might directly contradict each other? And so I think our panelists have spoken to that in some way. And Tahil, I don't know if you want to take a chance at responding to that, or Liz, or even Dr. Keisha.
Yeah, when we're sticking to the dialogical aspect of engaging, complete difference, two stakeholders in a conversation need to keep in mind that assumptions are not going to define the conversation, because that's how you kind of take it downhill. One of the things that I always invite people to do when it comes to learning about other people, even if they disagree each other, is don't ask them leading questions, or don't ask questions of them in which you've already formulated an answer. We often do that in spaces where we have assumptions around identities and contexts of people, or misunderstandings of people, even before we've engaged in conversation with them. So rather than asking a question that says, isn't it true blank? Or rather than asking a question, oh, aren't you, and you fill in the blank yourself, that's where you can stop yourself from saying, maybe I should just let the person answer the question so I get a better understanding. And I think at the end of the day, I don't think you should hold an expectation that says you're going to have a resolution after one conversation. The dialogical nature of how you engage these deep disagreements about rights and freedom and livelihood and the validity and the worth of someone's life are not ones that you can actually fix overnight. So don't have an expectation for that. But think about the ways that you can plant the seed of how one's assumptions and maybe dehumanizing attitudes can be changed when they better understand the context of where you come from through things like storytelling, which actually prove the person's point completely wrong. I've had to face that in a number of in-person and virtual exchanges, because a lot of people like to assume things about me being from a dual religious background as a Hindu and a Sikh, for being a larger Indian man, for being bisexual, for being a lot of different things that in their mind disqualifies me from even being human, let alone sharing space and thought with them. And this is where you have to build up a bit of I wouldn't even say a thicker skin, but I think a more honest and more divine approach, if you are religious, to be able to enter a space and say, hey, what you're understanding may be true in some ways, but it's not my truth. And you have to let me express my truth for you to better understand where I come from. And this is what oftentimes occurs between people who are religious and secular. I've been in a lot of interfaith spaces that to this day will not allow atheists or secular humanists to participate, because interfaith does not actually imply that people who are not religious or spiritual can be in the space. And actually, in a lot of secular spaces, people fear the idea of doing interfaith work for that very reason. So it's where you actually have to go in and say, we have to change the understanding of the terms. We have to use more inclusive terms. We have to not make assumptions about people when doing this work. And most importantly, why would you not need more stakeholders in trying to fix problems in your community? That's where you have to really put your guard down and say, oh, I may not agree with this person's point of view of the world, but we both agree that homelessness is a problem in Los Angeles. And we both have a responsibility to fix this problem as people and communities of privilege who have the resources to fix the problem. How do we do it together? And that's where you can start a different kind of conversation.
Yes. Thank you, Tahil. Thank you. I see that there is a question that was posed, and Caitlin wrote, I appreciate the framing of the Reformed Jewish doctor at a Catholic hospital and the inverted exception. In my work, I see LGBTQ plus child welfare professionals being forced to administer policies which discriminate against LGBTQ plus children and families because of the religious supremacy of their employer. Do you see an avenue to mobilize groups like the Reformed Jewish doctor at a Catholic hospital or LGBTQ plus child welfare professionals?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the things that our team at Auburn has been doing lately is to have conversations with religious providers, because for many of them, the public services that they do, which they offer to people, freely and without discrimination, are an expression of their faith values and their moral commitment to the well-being of their communities. So We want to be able to enable and empower them to be in space with people from a variety of communities, and to be in space respecting others' rights, respecting others' beliefs, and providing the quality of care that everybody deserves. So I think like being able to treat, and not to be able to treat, but to encourage religious providers to treat these questions with a lot of sensitivity and a wide sense of their complexity is one of the ways that you can empower that individual provider to take that stance when they need to. Part of it is asking them to reflect on what is the faith value that helps me, that I'm combining with my professional ethics in this moment, whether it's as a doctor or as a nurse practitioner, in the same way that you would invite somebody who's running a business to think about their business professional ethics and how that shapes the way that they show up and design their employer context. And so we want to be able to think about not just the individual provider's religious freedom and not just the patient's religious freedom, but like the religious perspectives of the context in which they're working. Very often religious organizations, just as we were saying a few questions ago, religious organizations sometimes get to shape public perception of what a religion believes and is and does. And so you do have to, in some senses, work through the institution to be able to access the people who are the frontline providers, where they know the world is more complex than it sometimes looks like in the employee handbook. They know that people come to them in desperation. And so they are moved by their own moral values to be able to show up in a humane way. And so we just want to be able to empower those folks where they are.
Absolutely. Did anyone else want to respond to that? If not, I see that one of the easier questions I think that's in the Q&A, and thank you, Dr. Keisha, is what is the name of the report? And so the report is authored by Auburn Seminary and Columbia Law School Law Rights and Religious Project. Is titled All Faiths and None, A Guide to Protecting Religious Liberty for Everyone. And I believe that Blair has placed the link to that report in the chat where you can access it. There is another question. What action can the average person take from this to promote religious freedom? Anyone? I feel like we've talked about it numerous times, but I don't want to miss the opportunity if someone just joined for us to share. I think it's important for us to engage in dialogue, as Dr. Keisha has talked about, as Tahil has talked about, as Liz have already talked about, the importance of even thinking about our neighbors on the most basic level, right? Like your literal neighbor, like think about your neighbor. When I do this work that I do for religious freedom, I do it from a place thinking about the people that I say I love and I care about. I think about the issues in that way. I think about the issues that have impact in my life and the lives of those that, again, I say that I love. And so for me, I look at it through that lens, valuing the human dignity of every person. What you can do is you can read the report. You could also share the report with others. You can check out the work that we're doing at our various institutions to really to amplify these conversations, whether it's at United Religious Initiative, whether it's through the Law, Rights, and Religion Project, or if it's at Auburn Seminary or the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation. We're all doing work. And so continue the conversation. Don't let this be your one and done. Like make sure you're talking about it. And also, Liz, I see that your hand is up, but also, you know, there are plenty of op-eds, and I actually just recently wrote an op-ed that leans into this conversation in a way that could be controversial for some people, but to talk about the importance of even the Black faith community supporting LGBTQ equality and LGBTQ rights. And so you will see that I write it from a certain vantage point and experience of the beloved community from which I come from as well. So yes, Liz, you had your hand up. You wanted to respond to that?
Yeah, I'll add that I think, like with so many issues, like there's so much focus on big national things, but so much of these issues are local. It's the suburban community that is using zoning laws to try to stop, prevent a mosque from being built, or it's a fight over the construction of a pipeline and across and land that's sacred to a Native American community, or it's the dispute in a school district over whether or how they're going to teach about world religions in a way that's sensitive to to our pluralistic country. So I think that is always kind of the best place to start. These big name religious, Supreme Court religious liberty cases are really daunting, and not and I can completely understand saying like, I don't even know where to begin to use my voice in this kind of enormous national debate over this Supreme Court case or this federal law or what have you. So look for what's going on locally. Even if there is no one particular fight that's happening in your location, or or issue, what conversations can you have in your faith community? Can you, bring a dialogue or about the report or about another piece of another issue into conversation at your house of worship? So those are all some kind of thoughts.
I mean, ultimately, the work that we're talking about is not just, as we said earlier, about politics or about even saving the nation state. It's about human transformation. And it just so happens that the way that we parse out human transformation is about the day-to-day questions, our lived experience in our communities, and our ability to feel like we have agency where we live and work. And those are the practical considerations that we bring to this question. But ultimately, our goal is to see that all people have what they need to flourish and thrive. And so when we think about that, and when we center that, it does become less daunting because it isn't determined by the lawsuit cycle or the headlines, but it gives us a base from which to engage those things and to think about those things in terms of their impact on ordinary people, wherever they might be, and whatever their commitments are.
I would add that you start local and you start with what you're familiar with. Who's in your area? Who's in your locus of conversation? Whether it's your individualized faith community, whether it's your coworkers, your family, those are the places where you want to start off with, because those are the places where you can start building those stronger connections to engaging these bigger topics. If you don't feel comfortable enough to start there, then you start off with the familiar issues that you can think about. What is going on in your community and how is it impacting these national conversations? A lot of what we're discussing as what got up to being Supreme Court level cases are cases that happen in everyday communities. We're talking about the abortion that is denied to a person in a local clinic. We are talking about the LGBT couple denied a service from a local bakery. We're talking about the atheists that don't feel comfortable when their local politicians are praying before a session opens. These are happening. These are conversations happening all the time around the country. So this is all about you paying attention to where you're at and how you're engaging. You don't need to do anything as big as trying to dismantle a SCOTUS case to feel like you're making a big difference, because it has to start small and at the grassroots.
Yes, thank you, Tahel. That is a perfect way to end this conversation. And I just want to thank all three of you, all three of our panelists that have shared robustly about the importance of religious freedom and why we need to have these conversations and continue this work. in our small corner of the world, right? That's where we can make a difference in our small corner of the world, starting local. And that's where it continues to have impact on state and national and global levels. And so I just want to say thank you to all of you for joining us today. I invite you to, again, visit the websites for each one of the organizations that are represented on these calls. And I encourage you also to continue to follow these organizations on Twitter, see what we're up to, see what's happening. There are lots of things in which you can, and ways in which you can engage. And with that, I do want to invite you that on January 20th, I will be presenting for the First Amendment Museum as their keynote speaker, talking about the urgency in reimagining religious freedom. And so this is kind of like a follow-up to this conversation. So we invite you to join us. And again, I just want to say thank you for being with us today. Thank you, Dr. McKenzie, Liz Platt, and Tahil Sharma for being with us. We're grateful for your work and your advocacy and the ways in which you engage and help educate the community on this topic. I also want to say thank you to all of you for joining us for this conversation. It will be available at a later time on the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation's website. So we encourage you to visit our website on our events page to see what's happening. Feel free to reach out to us. And again, we just want to say thank you. And we hope that you do something to advance and to remember the legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King today. And so whether that's continuing conversations about justice, equality, and equity, or if it's even having the conversations about why we should cherish religious freedom for people of all faiths and none, I ask that you do that today. So have a wonderful evening and thank you.